Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We're very excited to be presenting our next in the series, our Educator Effectiveness webinar series. Today we'll be talking about effective differentiation, a guide for teachers and leaders. With us today, we have Dr. Carol Ann Tomlinson, and I'm your host, facilitator for today's event, Elizabeth Greniger. Before we talk a little bit more about the wealth of background and experience that Carol brings to this topic, I'd like to find out a little bit about who's in our audience today. In a moment, you'll see a poll come up on your screen, and you'll have several options to select from. Excellent to see so many teachers in the audience today. I think this will be highly relevant to the work that you all do. Be quite a range of other folks joining us too. It's an important topic that touches on everyone's role. So I think that through the course of the 2 hours we'll spend together, you'll all get something that will really help you in the position that you serve and the work that you do to help teachers and students meet students' needs. Okay, we'll move that one off. I'll take this opportunity to introduce you to today's speaker. Our presenter, Carol Ann Tomlinson, is a faculty member at the University of Virginia's Curry School of Education. She's also the co-director of the university's Institute of Academic Diversity. She's the author of over 200 articles, book chapters, books, and other professional development materials. You have probably all read some of what she's written over the last several years. She is the author of several books for ASCD, including How to Differentiate Instruction in Mixed Ability Classrooms and The Differentiated Classroom, Responding to the Needs of All Learners. Of note, Carol was also a classroom teacher for 21 years, so she brings that experience to the work that she does, which I think is highly valuable and applicable to the conversation we're going to have today. So at this time, I would like to turn it over to Carol.
Thanks to all of you for spending some time with us this afternoon. I can only imagine how busy your lives are and how many things are pulling on your attention all the time. We'll do our best to make it a strong afternoon and one in which we hopefully can share with you some thoughts that expand your current thinking or give you something else to think about as you go. Our work this afternoon will focus on 4 key areas, kind of 4 buckets that we're going to work with. I want to share with you a little bit about what research says about differentiated instruction, give you some concrete examples of differentiation that seems to me to live up to the term quality, talk with you a bit about things that help prepare teachers to get better and better at attending to the variance in their classrooms, and then talk a little bit about how school leaders can support teachers in becoming more responsive to the students that they teach. So those are sort of the 4 big areas that we'll work with. And I want to begin by giving you just a couple of thoughts about what differentiation is. I think it's always helpful when talking with somebody to make sure whether you're on the same page or not and what you're talking about. And one of the interesting experiences that I have is when I have the opportunity to work with teachers in schools, I sometimes find that if there's a staff of 50 teachers, there are at least 49 different definitions of what differentiation is. So to have a sense of pointing in a same direction, to have a shared framework for our conversation, I'd like to start here. To me, differentiation is not any particular set of instructional strategies. It's really a way of thinking about teaching and learning. And there are many ways that I could elaborate on that, but at the very least, it's acknowledging that we differ as human beings and that so many things in our lives don't work particularly well when they're one size fits all. And that the job of the teacher is to make sure that students learn as much as they possibly can in the best ways they possibly can. And so for me, differentiation is honestly acknowledging that variance in your classroom and the demands that that variance puts on you as a teacher, and simply setting out to say, I truly do believe I can do a little bit better every day in understanding the students that I teach and aiming what I'm doing at them and talking with them in ways that benefits them much more as learners than if I just assume that most of the kids in my class are pretty much copies of one another. So differentiation is an approach to teaching that really emphasizes the centrality of students in learning and the centrality of learning in classrooms. One of my students proposed the definition of differentiation as being respectful teaching, that when we truly respect someone, we want to know them, and we honor what we know about them by responding in ways that seem positive to that person. It's a little difficult to assume how you'd be truly respectful of a student if you appeared not to be aware of the fact that that student was really thinking because he or she didn't understand what was going on, or not even to acknowledge that the student who's sitting in front of you has known for weeks the things that we're continuing to go over in the classroom. Important to understand the role of culture, the role of economics, the role of gender in teaching, and to be responsive to those things as well. One kind of quick way to think about differentiation, and it's a big, bold strokes, but actually if each of us as teachers just worked with this idea and kept on with it over time, we'd get better. To me, differentiation is kind of shaking up the classroom so that there are more ways for kids to take in content and information, more ways for them to make sense of content, and more ways for them to show what they have learned. Some folks would refer to those three elements as content, process, and product. And really that's the essence of differentiation. There are so many ways to teach information to help kids engage with it. And the more we expand on the repertoire we have there, the better. Many different ways that kids can make sense of and come to own what we need them to learn. And giving them more and more opportunity to process that information in ways that work for them is really helpful. And our goal is for kids to learn something. If the way that we ask them to express their learning limits their capacity to show us what they've learned, then we haven't done them a favor. So a great question to ask is, in what ways might I enable my students to show the maximum amount that they know, rather than this is the one thing everyone needs to do. Teachers can differentiate instruction based on 3 student attributes, and all of us see the variance in this in front of us every day. Kids come to us at different entry points, different readiness levels, no matter what content we teach. They come to us with vastly different interests, passions, things they care about. And they approach learning in many different ways. And so when we differentiate instruction, what we really try to do is differentiate the previous item, content, process, and product, in response to students' readiness levels, their interests, and their approaches to learning. A student of mine a couple of years ago, a pre-service teacher who I think is going to make a mighty fine teacher, proposed this definition to me. He was just 2 or 3 weeks into our class, had been doing a good bit of reading and trying to formulate some big picture sense of what differentiation means. And he said, differentiation to me is a sequence of common sense decisions made by teachers with a student-first orientation. And I like that. I think it's an important statement. Differentiation is not an extra. It's just part of the common sense of teaching. And I think those of us who keep the students in the very forefront of our thinking versus the notion that we're supposed to dish out stuff or cover information or prepare kids for a test are more likely to be struck by the student variance and to feel the need to do something about that. The student's name was Adam, and he went on to say that as he was reading about differentiation and listening and trying to figure it out, he thought it called on us as teachers to attend to 5 key elements. And these are, for me, the essence of a classroom, teaching anywhere, anytime, with anybody. And they are the areas that we have to attend to well in order to teach well. And to me, to teach well is to teach each student well, not just to sort of teach it down the middle kind of well enough. So he said, I think we have to make sure that the learning environment in our classroom is invitational for kids, that every kid comes in there every day thinking this is going to be a good place for me. It's a hard job for a teacher. We don't spend as much time talking about that as we do in test prep, but it's critically important, and research continues to tell us that if that isn't working well for a student, much of what else we do won't work well either. He said we have to keep working with our curriculum to make sure that we're taking students to a powerful learning destination, one that engages their minds and helps them understand the world around them. And then he said, you know, if you care enough about the kids to work on that environment, and you care enough about the curriculum to work on that and continue to develop and polish it, it seems like you'd want to keep checking constantly to find out where the kids are relative to that stuff that matters, where the people that matter so much are relative to the stuff that matters so much. And in that case, he says, number 3 seems inescapable. You'd use formative assessment, because how else would you know whether things are working? And then he said something that I thought was pretty astute for a very young teacher. He said, I really believe that if you use formative assessment, almost every time you're going to find out that no matter how swell you were the day before, the kids are still in very different places. And so formative assessment then will let you know when you need to make some modifications in content or process or product based on students' learning needs. And ultimately, there's a 5th thing that we have to do to make the first 4 work, and that is that we have to become good leaders in flexible classrooms, working with kids so that they understand what the game plan is and are eager to help us with it, and then helping develop, and with the assistance of kids, implementing classroom routines that enable us sometimes to focus on the whole group, sometimes to focus on subsets of the whole group, sometimes to focus on individuals. So there's a graphic here that depicts what differentiation might look like to me, because I believe that those first 4 elements on Adam's list have to turn together in the classroom. And so again, whether we use the terminology or not, every day, all of us create some kind of environment. We work with some sort of curriculum. We should be engaging in some sort of persistent assessment, and we make instructional decisions. And how well those things turn and how much they can attend to the individuals that we teach depends a lot on these boxes that are outside. We have to become good at leading kids to join us in a classroom where everybody works together for the success of everybody. And we have to get better and better and more comfortable and more proficient each day with managing a classroom where more than one thing at a time can happen when that's necessary. A point that I'd like to make to you here, because it answers questions that I'm asked real often, is that differentiation is really necessary for all students. It's not something that's just for kids with special ed identification. It's not something that was designed for kids who are identified as gifted. It's not something that's necessary only for English language learners. Every student will have variance in their readiness. Every student brings to us different interests, has varied approaches to learning, has certain traits of background that are going to shape how they see the world and how they learn. Not only is it imperative to understand that every kid needs us in different ways, but it's also really important to understand that you truly can't differentiate instruction very well for only one kind of kid, if you put kind in quotation marks. I've had teachers say to me, and I understand where this is coming from, They'll say, I get what you're talking about, how to use this reading strategy with these 6 kids that I have in my class who are struggling with reading, but what am I supposed to do with the other 24? Or I get what you're saying about something that would be really useful for a kid who's very advanced in math, but what am I supposed to do with all the other kids while I'm working with that one? We have to be able to see the classroom in terms of flexibility. When we get to the place where we say, I sort of see how I can have 2 things happening now, and then maybe 3, and maybe as many as 4, never 25 or 30 in the sense of, totally different everything. But that flexibility is really critical. If we can't figure out how to think about the needs of all the students we have, we'll never be particularly successful with addressing the needs of 1 or 2 particular subsets of students. Differentiation has 3 key pillars. It comes with a philosophy. And among the points in that philosophy are that diversity in our world is pretty normal. And in fact, it's pretty valuable. And it's useful for kids, enriching for us to be surrounded by different lives and different perspectives and different ways of doing and looking at things. And so rather than trying to figure out how to parse kids into little bundles and put them in homogeneous bundles, we actually, especially in today's world, benefit kids by helping them learn to hear and understand and appreciate one another. Differentiation comes with a growth mindset orientation, and that is that we're better as teachers when we look at our students as being something like icebergs. We can see some capacity above the surface of the water, but much of the capacity of every kid is hidden beneath the surface. And good teaching says, give me some time and a kid and I'll make that iceberg rise. You'll see more above the tip. But no matter how much I can get to rise above the surface, I know there's more and more and more that that student can accomplish and that I can accomplish with that student, looking at students in terms of possibilities rather than deficit. Differentiation asks us as teachers to accept maximum responsibility for the progress of each learner. My job is not to cover curriculum, but it's to get the most out of every student that I possibly can working side by side with that student. But a big part of the philosophy of differentiation, and we'll talk about this in just a little bit, a tad more, is to say school ought to offer every kind of kid equity of access to excellence. And there are lots of barriers that we have in school that create barriers to accessing that excellence for lots of kids. In my experience, and I think in the experience of a great many researchers, we do better again when we bring kids together with all their variety and talk about ways in which we can address the variety than when we restrict access to really good teaching and learning opportunities for some students. Differentiation has 5 key principles, and they are Adam's 5 elements of differentiation that I showed you. The environment is the catalyst for learning. Quality curriculum is an imperative to ensure that students are learning robustly. Assessment should inform instruction and teaching and learning. Instruction should be adapted to help us respond in the best way that we can to move each kid forward from their current point of work. And leading and managing a flexible classroom is an imperative for being able to deal with student differences in a meaningful and comfortable way. There are lots of practices in differentiation that are extremely important, and in truth, each of these could become a pretty good webinar. But I just want to mention a few of them to you in the sense that I hope they will take a little root in your head and that you'll continue to sort of ponder where you are with each of these things. Almost all teachers differentiate to some degree. If you want to survive in a classroom, you have to figure out some different ways to handle kids' behavioral quirks. And if you have a heart, when you see a kid sinking with something, you instinctively reach out to throw them a lifeline. And when you see a kid who's really excited about something you're teaching, you frequently will just almost instinctively go to that student and help them continue to think forward with that. But much of the differentiation that we do in schools, until we learn a different way to think about it, is what I've come to call reactive differentiation. That is, we still bring in the same lesson plan for everybody and hope like the dickens it's going to work. And then when it doesn't, we run around and try to offer extra help or find another piece of material or put out a fire. That will always be a part of teaching. But robust differentiation asks us to come in with an awareness of learning goals and an awareness of where students are in proximity to those goals, and a growing awareness of the interest and approaches to learning that the kids bring with them, and then proactively come in when it seems wise to do so with more than one thing that we might be able to do in the classroom in that day to help move students forward. So proactive rather than reactively planned differentiation is really important. It asks that we choose instructional approaches, whether those are approaches of inquiry, learning contracts, small group instruction with the teacher, using internet materials. Choose particular tools that we're going to use based on two things: the nature of the content and the needs of students. And then three really critical elements to make differentiation successful. Teaching up, which we'll look at again in just a minute, suggests that we have to start planning with somebody. If you're going to do three things tomorrow, you don't usually plan all three of them simultaneously. Start somewhere and then make modifications. It suggests that we'll do the very best for the most kids if we plan first for advanced learners, and then we see differentiation as a way of scaffolding more and more kids to work with really rich, meaty, complex content. It's a great thing to think about with Common Core, because Common Core expects us to teach up, very evident in everything that's available on that. Respectful tasks suggest that when we are going to have more than one thing at a time, we have to be really careful not to have some kids that continually work with really cool, fascinating, wonderful stuff that has good appeal to it, and other kids keep doing drill and practice all the time. Everybody has some grunge work they need to do every once in a while, but unfortunately sometimes some kids' work is almost a signal that this is a student that the teacher perceives can't really do anything important, and other students seem to be the favored ones all the time. If we expect students to work with us on a classroom where multiple things are happening, all those things need to be respectful of the dignity and possibilities of all of the kids. And finally, flexible grouping says, you know what, you can do better than bluebirds, buzzards, and wombats in your classroom. We ought not to be thinking about kids in classrooms as ones who are smart and ones who are average and ones who are not smart and kind of plugging them in that way, but rather to ask ourselves, given where we are today, where's the best place for this particular student or these 4, 5, 6, 30 students to work? And we ought to be trying to arrange kids in many kinds of groupings based on the particular tasks of the day. Sometimes similar readiness, but sometimes mixed readiness. Sometimes similar interests, sometimes mixed interests. Sometimes similar approach to learning, sometimes mixed approach. Sometimes groups that last a few days, some that last only a few minutes. Sometimes teacher choice, sometimes student choice. When we do that, we see kids in many more lights, and we find many more ways we can teach that are effective for them. And the kids don't peg each other again as the ones the teacher thinks can learn, the ones the teachers think have moderate hope, and the no hopes over in the corner. The flexible grouping is also really important. Okay, so I've spent a few minutes giving you some of my thoughts about differentiation and what it might mean, how we might define it, how we might think about it, its key elements. Which of the perspectives that I've shared with you this far resonate with your experience? And we're going to give you a chance to respond to that question now, and Elizabeth will lead us there.
Great. Thank you so much, Carol, for that detailed overview. We are going to open up this question in just a moment. I want to do a few housekeeping notes because I know there's a lot of activity going on in the parking lot and the technical issues box. So I want to just make sure that everyone knows where you can get some assistance. Our parking lot is generally used for content-related discussion, so if you have questions for Carol or if you want to engage with other participants, you can make any comments or questions there. If you do have technical issues, which I do see some people are having some issues with sound or with seeing the PowerPoint on the screen, please do note that in the technical issues box, and our team behind the scenes will do their best to help you with your individual situations. A question that came up and that always comes up is, when can we see this PowerPoint or this presentation, the video of it? And that will be available in the next several days. You should get an email following today's event that gives you the link for that, and you can share that with other colleagues or people that were unable to attend today. If you are having some difficulties with the sound, that will be a good way for you to have a chance to see the entire webinar. So I think that's our housekeeping. And the other thing is that I think Nicole had mentioned it in one of the questions, but the resources to download box in the bottom does have the PowerPoint, so you can download it there and have a copy for yourself to look at. I think that's it for the moment. Let's pull up our pod with our question, and like Carol said, we're really interested in hearing from all of you about really what aspects of differentiation in the definitions and the description that she provided resonate with you and the experience you have in schools. Looks like a few folks are familiar and using flexible grouping. That's wonderful to see. I really like that notion of proactive versus reactive too. I think that resonated with a few others. Carol, in seeing the responses from folks, how did these experiences, how are they similar or different than what you're seeing from your pre-service teachers and the teachers out in the field that you're working with?
That's actually an interesting question, Elizabeth. Folks tell us often that pre-service teachers have so many skills that they have to develop that it's really, really hard for them to focus in on the finer points. And so I've referred to that sometimes in writing as pre-service teachers needing to develop the gross motor skills of teaching and expert teachers working really hard to develop the fine motor skills of teaching. And I think to some degree that's true. But we actually find that our pre-service teachers grasp the notion of differentiation much more quickly than veteran teachers sometimes do. Of course, you can't generalize across any group. But I think that's because they don't have so many habits already developed. Somebody said once that making a major change, it's not usually the thing that you're changing to that's so hard, it's letting go of the thing that you've always done. And I think that's true with differentiation as well. But I would have to say, as I'm quickly trying to read through these, I'm impressed and encouraged with the number of things people have seized onto and with the positive ways that they're looking at the ideas that they're taking in through their own experiences. So that's a pretty cool thing to see.
Absolutely. And one of the questions that we got a couple times in advance of today's webinar, and I see Patricia's asking, how do we make sure that teachers understand that this isn't really about more work for them, that, having a classroom where you differentiate is really going to put all these pieces together and end up, I wouldn't say less work in the end, but it's going to maximize your efforts. So I know you're going to talk a lot about that throughout today's presentation and give us some realistic examples of differentiation in practice and how that can play out. So we'll hold kind of on that thought and get us moving along into the next section so that you can share some more jewels of knowledge.
Okay, so let me say in regard just to that one thing you said, one comment and then a couple in regard to the parking lot questions that I was able to glimpse that quickly. For those of you who asked early on in this little thread about could I give you an example of teaching and what that might look like, we actually are going to do that when we get to the concrete examples. I'm going to share with you one that I think illustrates that point really well, so hang tight, we will be looking at those. And then in regard to the comment that Elizabeth just made about helping teachers understand that differentiation isn't intended to pile more things on them, but is sort of a different effort. I have a friend who is fond of saying that if you decide that you want to lose weight, it's probably not smart to go ahead and eat the regular meal that you had planned to eat and then eat the reduced calorie food on top of that. It's probably a little wiser to replace one with the other. And I think that's the case with many changes in schools. It is the case that leaders in schools of all kinds, veteran teachers, grade level chairs, and department chairs, principals, curriculum coordinators, special ed folks, everybody needs to help us understand that differentiation can't be about doing everything you always did and then adding something else. It's really about trying to understand equivalences, and instead of doing this, I might do this, or instead of investing in this, I might get more power if I did this thing. The truth of the matter is, I don't know how to make teaching easy. And so when I hear really often, this is kind of hard, I always think, but you're standing in front of human beings. It's going to be hard. If it's going to work well, it's going to be hard. And I think most good teachers are not afraid of hard work. I think what we really are concerned about is that we don't know how to do better until somebody helps us see that. And so I'm going to talk with you later in the session about some things that I think leaders in schools can do to really be helpful in helping teachers develop the confidence and the competence over time in a very stepwise kind of way. I think we sometimes as teachers get this notion that if we can't do something perfectly next Monday, we should just give it up. I think great teaching is a lifelong pursuit, and I think differentiation is a part of that. And we shouldn't expect ourselves to master something complex in a day, a week, a month, or a year, any more than we expect our students to master all of mathematics in a day, a month, a week, or a year. We need to be into it for a long haul and to help to have leaders who support us in understanding that process and charting it out for ourselves in a way that makes sense. So if we can remove this question slide, whoops, then we can kind of go. Here we go then. So the next thing I want to do is share with you three, I guess, rationales for differentiation, three reasons why it's probably worth the effort that we're going to put into it to give it a try, why it matters to be responsive to kids' needs. And that's really all differentiation is trying to respond to the human beings that are sitting out there in front of us. So I'm going to look briefly, and I'm going to try to do all of these briefly. You'll have slides that you can look at that will help you if you want to go back and review, and also some resources that will be listed at the end of the session if you'd like to read further. So I'm going to look briefly at some things that theory and research in education tell us about differentiation. Then we're going to look at some demographic arguments for differentiation. And then I want to just briefly sort of drop in the notion of ethics as a reason for differentiation. So first of all, theory for attending to student readiness, does it matter to know where a kid's entry point is? We're supposed to be teaching 6th grade math by George, and that's what this book is, and then I've got some kids that are still struggling with 3rd grade math and some that could probably be okay in high school. Does it matter to attend to that, or should I just forge down the pike? Theorists in education have talked about things like with Vygotsky with his notion of the zone of proximal development. And he said, you know, we only grow as human beings when the thing we're trying to do is a little out in front of us and somebody helps us over that hump. And then as soon as we get over the hump, somebody needs to put something that's a little too far in front of us out there again and help us over that hump. People in brain research call that moderate challenge. And as it turns out, brain research is suggesting to us that Vygotsky was exactly right. We have to learn when something's a little bit too hard for us. Theorists also suggest that when kids continue to try to do stuff that makes no sense to them, they get really frustrated and ultimately become discouraged learners. And on the other hand, when kids are continually told to do homework or practice in class with something that they already fully understand, that's equally frustrating as well. And so theorists suggest to us that there's a relationship between student achievement and the teacher's ability to know where a kid is and provide that piece that comes next that's a little too far out in front. So that's what folks have theorized in education about readiness and whether it matters to attend to it. Here's some information on research that stems from that theory. Again, this is a very brief capsule of a great deal of stuff, but in fact, studies in a lot of areas, in reading, in multi-age classrooms, in gifted education, in special education, in regular ed classrooms, show us that when we can get tasks at the right levels of challenge for kids, achievement gains happen for a very broad range of students. So in other words, our capacity to pitch the lesson, the actual goals that we have will rarely need to change in most contemporary classrooms, all kinds of schools. But generally, the goals that we have won't shift that much. But trying to pitch what the kid's going to work on just a little too far out for that kid is a skill that really benefits kids when teachers gain it. And the gains that we see occur across economic ranges, grade levels, and achievement levels. The bottom line on research on readiness-based differentiation really is this: if you want your kids to grow academically, they have to be working with something that's a little too hard for them as individuals. Then folks have some theory about whether it matters to attend to kids' interests in a classroom. I've got a kid who's in love with baseball, but that just doesn't happen to be in the Common Core standards. I've got a kid who just can't sit still because he's so excited about music, or truly loves comic books, or 1,000 other things that might be out there. Does it matter to try to figure out what that interest stuff is in a classroom and do anything about it, or is that just really beyond the scope of what's meaningful and possible? So theorists, again, a few of whom, but not all by any manner of means, are listed at the bottom of the slide, have theorized that helping kids pursue their own interests through the lens of what you're teaching really maximizes their engagement with learning. That when we can do that, when we can tap a student's interest in the context of the things that we need to be teaching, learning is much more likely to be rewarded, and students are much more likely to just take off as autonomous learners. And they've theorized that what people call flow is much more likely to occur when students can do something that they seriously love doing, can get lost in it. They tell us that there's almost no psychological condition that's more satisfying to humans in that sense of doing something that's so absorbing that the time just flies by and you have no idea where that hour went. So all of these theorists are suggesting to us that tapping into interest really has a great deal to do with students' willingness to devote themselves to learning. What does research tell us there? Again, this is a real digest of a lot of stuff, but here are a couple of examples, and then I'll tell you sort of what the bottom line is with interest. Just a couple of examples. There was an article quite recently about some research that's been done with students who have continued on through school and into college with more advanced mathematics. In other words, they've bought into themselves as students who should be engaging with math, and they do that. And what they found in working with those students who have continued on is that teachers who had really high expectations for them, not just drill and practice, but I expect you to understand this, to participate in discussions about it, unpack your thinking. Don't care if it's not quite right yet. That's not the point. We need to learn how to think about this. When teachers have those high expectations, and when they let kids know that they're pleased with their hard work and that the kids are willing to hang on with complex tasks, those things made a lot more difference in the kids' willingness to continue with math than did the kids' perceptions of their ability. In other words, the kids that they looked at weren't like, okay, I was born smart in math and that's how come I'm doing this, and people have always told me I was smart. The fact that teachers expected a great deal of them, supported them in doing that, and praised them for hanging on and toughing it out when it was difficult, even if they didn't get the thing right, mattered more than their perception of their ability. And then on a smaller level, a number of studies have been done, like this second one cited on the slide. In an algebra class, kids were divided into two groups. One group of kids, I think it was quadratic equations they were working on, I may be incorrect about that, but advanced level math for middle high school kids. Some of the kids were given just the book problems, and some of the kids were given problems that were personalized for them. And the way the personalized thing worked was this: that the researchers gave students interest inventories, and the kids were able to say things that they particularly liked spending their time on outside of school. So some of the kids in the personalized group might have gotten a problem to solve that was nested in baseball, and another one might have gotten one that was nested in the stock market or that was nested in driving. And what's interesting is they both got the same instruction, and the problems were all the same. It's just that the wording had to do with science or with music or with automobiles. And what they found was that the kids who got the personalized problems did much better on the math problems than the kids who just got the generic ones. The researchers point out that at some point you have to help the kids be able to transfer from a problem on the stock market to any other problem. But it made a significant difference in students' achievement at the outset, and it worked best for the kids who saw themselves as the weakest math students. So again, if you can hook what you're teaching onto interest, and I'm going to show you an example of that later as well, that makes a difference. So when we go back to the readiness thing, what research and theory tell us is if you want kids to grow academically, it helps to address readiness. What the interest-based research and theory tells us is if you want high motivation for kids, then it's really helpful to tap into their interest. The third element that we can differentiate in response to is the student's learning profile. That has to do with how we take in information and process it. Do we feel like we learn better when we can watch somebody do a task first and then read the directions? Or might we be the person who does much better if you'll just hush and let us read the thing 3 times and then show us, because that reading is going to really benefit us? Are you a student who does better by kind of thinking outside the box and coming up with unusual applications of things? Or are you a student who does really well with picking things apart and kind of putting the parts back together in wholes? This one topic would again be another good webinar, kind of a complex one. This is the one area in which experts have pretty strong disagreements about the wisdom and efficacy of working with this in schools. Learning profile is impacted by 3 things, or 4 potential things: learning style, culture, gender, and intelligence preferences. Those are the 4 bodies of theory and research that support attending to this particular notion of the fact that kids learn in different ways. There doesn't seem to be too much disagreement about the fact that there's some interesting differences in the way males and females can learn, although of course not all females learn the same way, not all males learn the same way. There are no sharp dividing lines. But we do seem over the years to have traced down the notion that gender can impact how we learn. Quite a bit written on the fact that culture impacts how we learn. And when you go to a school that is rooted very strongly in one particular majority culture, and you don't happen to be a part of that majority culture, things can feel out of sync a lot. And so a lot of what we talk about in terms of culturally relevant pedagogy has to do with aligning ways we teach with the ways that all of our students can see the world. So those two things, culture and gender, don't seem to be too much of a sticking point. There are researchers who feel strongly that we don't have a body of evidence that supports differentiating in terms of learning style and intelligence preference. And I think even the intelligence preference thing is probably murky because folks tend to talk about it in a way that doesn't accurately represent the work that people in that field have done. But here's the thing for me, this would be my caution. I'm not a big fan of downloading a learning style or an intelligence preference survey and giving it to kids and saying, okay, now I know you're the part-to-whole learner, you're the kinesthetic learner. Several reasons for that being not particularly effective practice. In the first place, very few of those surveys have any reliability or validity. In the second place, we have no reason to think that a kid is the same kind of learner in every subject or at every point in a learning cycle or even at the same time of day. So my best shot is trying to say that if we have variety in the classroom and can help kids encounter and process and express things in different ways for a variety of reasons, that improves learning environment, attitude, perhaps speed of learning, that kind of thing, efficiency of learning. But in the end, theorists have suggested again that when we take in and express learning through preferred intelligences, we learn better. That reflects the works of Gardner and a few other folks that have looked at his approach to multiple intelligences. Robert Sternberg has hypothesized that when we can take in and express content in what he calls a triarchic theory of intelligence, that we learn better. And we have a lot of work from people like Dunn and Dunn who did their work like 20 or 30 years ago, that students score better, achieve better when their learning styles are matched to their learning opportunities. Folks criticize the Dunn and Dunn research because they say it doesn't have the rigor of 21st century research. And it probably doesn't, but I don't expect medicine 40 years ago had quite the rigor of 21st century medicine either. So at least at their point, they were doing research that was pretty well regarded. So what do theorists find, and what do researchers find out? I'm sorry, I'm skipping a step. This slide is still theory, and it deals with gender and culture. So again, people who are theorists and who watch things abstract from that tell us that some teaching styles and approaches may be advantageous to some kids and it's simultaneously disadvantageous to others. That's a cultural or gender issue. Learning can be hampered due to cultural mismatches or to gender mismatches. And also when we use varied approaches to teaching and learning and kids develop a voice about what's going to work better for them, that should be more effective for them. So in the end, here's what research tells us, or at least some chunk of it, that teaching through multiple modes leads to improved achievement across subjects, grade levels, contexts, that opening up the way we teach and the way we offer learning opportunities and helping kids decide which approach is going to work best for them does in fact lead to increased test scores. And I think this last idea, which comes from the work of Robert Sternberg, whose research I think is quite sound, finds in his research something that I think we need to look at and think about as teachers or as leaders with teachers. He finds that when kids can learn in accordance with their particular preferences for learning, they make higher scores on standardized tests, even when that test is not in their preferred mode. And that addresses the panic we have of, oh, I could let the kid do this, but the test isn't going to let him do this. I think sort of the subscript of Sternberg's work is that the test is not the same as instruction. It comes at the end of instruction. It shouldn't drive instruction. And when students can learn in a way that works for them, they probably go into that test with two benefits. One is they've learned more, and second, they see themselves as more successful, and that benefits the test as well. Again, this learning profile piece is a complex one, interesting to look at, and sort of mixed messages in some ways, including from some neuroscientists who are very experienced and who say the variety in the classroom is extraordinarily important, and some other neuroscientists who say we just don't know enough to support that yet. So I want to now kind of wrap this research piece up with a little bit on the work of John Hattie. Many of you probably know his work. He has done a massive job of doing a meta-analysis of over 800 meta-analyses, just a massive distillation of research that's available to us. And here are some things that he says are, whoops, I'm sorry, I'm going in the wrong way, directionally compromised. Here are some things that he concludes about research and teaching. He classifies hundreds of practices that we have commended over time in terms of their effectiveness in helping students learn. And what I'm going to show you here is just a tiny piece of that. But the way he tends to do his work, I don't know why I'm having trouble with this. This piece does not want to come up. Okay, so he wrote two books. He wrote Visible Learning, which is, and these are great things for you to look at if you haven't had the opportunity to do it. Really impressive, and not only is the research impressive, but he's a very clear writer. He remembers who his audience is. He first wrote a book called Visible Learning, and in that he says, okay, so here's what I found in terms of all of these hundreds of meta-analyses that I've looked at. And in very user-friendly terms, really, he shares with us the distillation of what he found from that research. And then not too long after that, he followed up with a second book called Visible Learning for Teachers. And he says, okay, so if Visible Learning says what I found out, then what the second book tells teachers what they might want to be thinking about based on that research and our findings. So he organizes the scores and scores of strategies he looked at under different categories. So he talks about ones that really should not be used at all in classrooms, ones that have only marginal value, ones that are kind of mediocre. And then he moves into 4 categories where he says these are the ones that we should be doing, let's have them. These are even more exciting. Here are some that are really among the best. And here are the best approaches in terms of impact on student learning. And what he's saying is, let's assume most teachers get 9 months of growth out of kids in 9 months. So then if that's the case, the big question for us is, what is it that teachers do that get more than 9 months out of kids in 9 months? And so he has some practices, for example, in general, grade retention does not seem to benefit achievement. And he lists a number of things that apparently either are negatives or strong negatives, some negative, mediocre, nothing, and then moves into the better ones. And what I want you to look at here is some of these categories. Effective classroom management that leads to flexibility. Small group learning, important, except that you have to have different materials for different groups. If you just put kids in groups and let them sit there, you don't have much. What makes small group learning powerful, he says, is when the group has materials and tasks that are appropriate to the needs of that group. Student engagement really matters, he says. That has a good impact on learning. And student motivation when they feel really in charge of their learning. Goals that are really challenging, that seem to make me stretch. Working with peers in a way that gives me a sense of community. Learning that's cooperative rather than competitive. Classroom that functions as a community. different models of quality work for students at different levels of proficiency so that kids can see what something might look like and not be working in the blind. Not labeling students. He thinks that labeling students is really a problem, and not labeling students is a benefit, pretty strong benefit. Using a variety of teaching strategies rather than the same tools over and over. Helping kids learn to be more collaborative than individualistic. And then the really big ones, formative assessment that carries feedback instead of grades, teacher clarity about kids and content, again, communal reciprocal teaching in a classroom. One of the most important is feedback that's targeted to that student. And second most, well, certainly among the most important still, is this teacher-student relationship. These things really are the cornerstones of differentiation. These are the practices that, and some others, but these are the practices that we really advocate. And so when he says we've looked at all these studies and this is what seems to propel us forward the best, what he's really talking about is many of the elements of differentiation that we've advocated really strongly. I'm going to finish this piece with a quote from Hattie, and I realize it's a little bit long, but it speaks directly to me as a teacher and helps me really sort of see the essence of differentiation, and I hope it will for some of you as well. In reality, what he's saying is, okay, so now I've told you about all these meta-analyses, now what? And differentiation is the topic that he brings up there. He doesn't exactly write this line, but it's sort of almost as though he's saying, look, when you see all the stuff, all the differences that come with kids, all the things teachers have to attend to, we're going to have to do something about that. We can't just sit there and say they're all alike and my job is just to teach sixth grade math and I'll teach it no matter what. But here's how he talks about differentiation. Teachers need to know where each student begins and is in his or her journey to meeting the criteria of the lesson. What are the student's strengths, gaps in knowledge? How much does the student understand? What learning tools does the student have, and how can we help the kid learn other tools to use in his or her behalf? And the teacher's going to have to provide different ways in which students can demonstrate mastery and understanding along the way to meeting the criteria for success. Rapid and formative feedback, he says, can be very useful. All classes, he says, are full of heterogeneity, which is likely advantageous because students can learn from one another if we set it up that way. An art of teaching, he says, is seeing the commonality among the differences and having peers work together around those commonalities. That's really at the crux of differentiation. Your goal is not to create 37 lesson plans for 37 students in a class. It's to see what common needs they have and to kind of clump them around those needs a good bit of the time. Clearly, sometimes we need to reach out for individuals as much as we can, and clearly there are lots of times when we need to work with the class. But the essence of differentiation is what patterns do I see in the student differences, and how do I reach out for those? And then he says, note that differentiation relates more to addressing students' different phases of learning, from novice to capable to proficient, rather than merely providing different activities to different groups of students. A common misunderstanding of differentiation that I see is as long as we're doing different things in the class, I must be differentiating. What he's saying here is the key is to understand where everybody needs to go and then understand the different journeys that kids are taking to get there, and providing something that is just a little too far out in front for that particular group of kids to move them on down the pike. The key is for teachers to have a clear reason for differentiation and to relate what they do differently to where the student is located on a progression of learning related to the topic at hand. In grouping students, the goal is to group students at varied places in the progression so students can move forward as they discuss with, work with, and see the world through the eyes of other students. In order for grouping to be effective, it requires structure and instruction for the students to develop the skills necessary for those things to happen. That's part of the fifth idea in Adam's list. We have to help kids understand what it is we're trying to do and develop the skills to work alongside us as our partners in effectively differentiated classrooms. So let's stop here for just a minute. We've looked at some theories about whether it matters or why it might matter to differentiate by readiness, and some research that says it gets us growth. We've looked at some theories about differentiating by interest and some research that says that buys us motivation. We've looked at some theories about differentiating by learning profile. And although there is some dispute about that one, in general there's a recognizable body of research that suggests to us that that buys us learning efficiency rather than causing everybody to work in the same way. And then we looked at the synthesis of Hattie's work, which I hope goes back for you to the 5 elements of differentiation that we talked about and the philosophy and the practices that we discussed. So we'll let Elizabeth take us into this next open-ended question that will help you reflect a little bit here.
Wonderful. There's a lot to think and digest with that last section on the research. And I know there are a few questions over there in the parking lot, which we'll get to. Right now, what we'll do is open up this question, and as Carol just kind of restated for us, we're interested in finding out from you if your experiences are in support or contradiction of these ideas of learner readiness, interest, and learning profile, and the research that was shared on those topics. So we're going to put that up and allow you to formulate your thoughts and get some ideas up there. Before I want to get to Jason's question, so Carol, if you have a chance to glance at that over in the parking lot,
yep,
that would be great. And I want to just call attention to one housekeeping item. Some folks were asking about the archive of the information that comes through our parking lot and through our open-ended questions. We will make those available after the webinar, like the video and the archived event. Those will be part of the materials that you'll receive an email about. So if you're not able, like us, to capture every single thing as it's coming through, just know that you'll have access to that information in a few days. So share away, share your ideas here in the question box. And then, Carol, let's take a look at Jason's question. A good one, and I think a concern that we in the classroom have is, how do we balance this expectation that we prepare students for a standardized test, but also embrace the notions of Hattie's research that we need to engage with students formatively and ensure that we're responding to their learning in real time.
Okay.
So if you have thoughts on that now, that would be great. Otherwise, we can hold it for a little later.
I'm sorry. Okay, sure. I was looking at a couple of these. Let me respond to David's question first, just really quickly, and then I'll try to hit Jason's a bit too. David asked whether research on learning styles emphasizes that students learn through a variety of approaches rather than a match with a specific learning style. And I want to be sure to say this to you. It's, fascinating thing about teaching is that poor old human brain can only process so much. And so I may say something in your head someplace else and it completely misses you, and that's what happens in front of us in classrooms as well. I said to you quickly that we have no reason to assume that kids are going to learn the same way in math and in literature, that they're going to learn the same way in the morning and in the afternoon, that they're going to learn the same way when they're just beginning to explore a complex topic as they will when they are very comfortable with it. And so the people who I think do the wisest writing would suggest to us that it's great to have options for students and help them decide which of these approaches is going to work best for me right now, and what does work best mean, and how do I monitor along the way to see if it is working. If it's not, what other choices do I have, rather than saying you are this kind of learner, so therefore you should do this kind of task. I'm with David, who seems to be suggesting that he believes also that this match a kid to a style is not useful. I think it's restrictive, and I think it doesn't reflect our best knowledge. So then Jason is sort of asking the question, as Elizabeth paraphrased for us, how do we, in his particular case, was how do we move to a system that embraces, I'm having trouble making this stay still in the box, how do we, as I'm remembering the question when it was sitting in front of me, that embraces feedback without grades. Truly, we have the biggest mess with grades on the planet. I don't know that there's anything we've done in teaching that we've made more convoluted than grades. And it's really not about a grade. It's about helping a kid know where they're supposed to be going, where they are, and what they can do about it to get there. An 82 doesn't tell me anything. But if the teacher says, this is the point at which you're struggling, you might want to check on X and Y, or look at this particular model, or here's the task at the center you could work on, try that and see where you go. That helps the kid much more securely understand what it is they need to do and how to move. I don't believe we have a scintilla of evidence that giving a kid a grade improves their achievement on a standardized test or anything else much, with the exception of the child who is particularly grade hungry, and as one of my students said, would kill his grandmother to get 2 points on a test. That student will continue to do whatever is necessary to get the 2 points on the test, but Carol Dweck will tell us that that's a student who's learning for reward and not for any satisfaction in learning. And what research tells us there is when we cut off the rewards, the learning quits as well. So I think with any of these things that seem a departure from what we do, I think we ought to study them as teachers and as leaders and talk about what knowledgeable people are saying about them and see what we think could be a good next step for us to try something, not throw everything out tomorrow and try something we don't understand yet, but really have good discussions about that. What does common sense seem to say? What's best practice look like here? And I would be glad to bet you my lunch money that if you had teachers who were willing to say, let me take a chance here, let me give kids very clear feedback, let me help kids learn to give each other, which is tricky as well, by the way, but learn to give each other good feedback. And I really believe my kids will be much more in charge of their learning and will learn much better and will therefore perform on a standardized test better. If you really believe that your life work is to help kids score better on the Common Core, and that's it, that's what you're there for, only to help them score better on the Common Core, I would still propose to you that Vygotsky's correct. You need to find out what that kid's next step is and move them along, rather than saying, yes, I know I'm teaching 6 months or a year ahead of the kid, or 6 months or 2 years behind the kid, but all I can do is cover it because that's what's on the test. If we're clear where we're going and we know where kids are and we can move them down the pike from where they are, I think we have ample evidence that they'll do better on the standardized test. My persuasion is that teaching is about building lives, and that kind of approach does a lot better with building lives as well. But even if we think it's only the standardized test, everything we know suggests that we have to take kids where they are and move them ahead from that point. We shouldn't be behind them, but we shouldn't be too terribly far ahead of them either.
Thanks, Carol, for getting to that question. I think the response was helpful, and as you've been taking some time with that, of course, folks are really responding to our question here in the open-ended poll, and I want to acknowledge those responses, but I want to also make sure we get to move along and hear all of the additional information you have to share with us. So I just want to summarize 1 or 2 themes that I saw in those responses, and maybe we won't really touch on them at the moment, but I think as we go through the rest of the content, we'll get back to some of these themes. One thing folks are saying is that this information and the research resonates with them and their experiences, their goals at their schools or districts, but there is still this element of complexity of teaching, which you alluded to earlier, that teaching is a difficult job, and there's a lot of variables at play in making all of the pieces come together in the classroom on a regular basis. So that's, I think, what people are generally struggling with and continuing to struggle with. That, yes, in theory, this all makes sense, but the how of making it happen. And some questions in the parking lot from Michelle and Laura are asking some more specifics about their situations and how do I work with this challenging situation. So I want to move on from this so that we can get to the rest of the information. If we have a chance, we'll circle back to some of those more specifics, if that's okay.
Absolutely. So if we can take down the question box now, that would be helpful, and we'll truck on. In terms of demographics, just really quickly, our kids do not come to us at the same entry point. They don't come with the same supports and opportunities as each other. They don't come with the same history and background, same interest, or necessarily learning in the same ways. It's very common these days, and in my opinion, a good thing, that we have second language learners seated next to a kid with learning challenges, seated next to a kid from a low-income background, seated next to an advanced learner, seated next to a kid with a low-income, an emotional challenge, seated next to kids from a variety of races and cultures, growing number of students who are homeless, huge variance in the experience of kids. And yet, despite that variance, and the variance will vary according to your schools, of course, but there really is no such thing as a homogeneous class, really never has been, but the idea these days seems way off target. But despite that, despite the fact that all of us as teachers see that variance, we still tend to teach as though pretty much all kids are exactly alike. So I think to myself sometime on this deal about the ethics of education, what would we do if we made instructional decisions from some sort of an ethical north, that thing on the compass that says this is the direction that is the soundest in terms of what's right? What if we made decisions on what was in the best interest of students, perhaps rather than what's on the best interest of a test score? And I don't think those two things are in conflict to each other, by the way, but it puts the emphasis in a different place. What would we do if we thought it was right, even if it wasn't popular? To what degree do we do what might be called caring about our students? Geneva Gay distinguishes between caring about students and caring for students. How much do we care about them? How much do we care for them? And here's what she says: teachers who care about their students really enjoy their company. They like to spend time with them. They enjoy conversations. They think about them some out of the classroom. They take pleasure in being with those students, and that's a good thing. When we find teachers who care about their kids, it's almost always a better place to be. But then she says there's another realm that we could go to, and that's caring for our students. And what she says that means is, if we're going to care for them as well as caring about them, it means that we will have to do whatever's necessary to ensure their welfare. In other words, it's not just that I enjoy your conversation. It's that I feel compelled to do in terms of scheduling, class possibilities, who teaches what, how I teach you, what materials I use. I feel compelled to do what's necessary to ensure that the best outcomes for you happen. What would happen if we worked from a caring for students as well as just caring about them? So two people who have been really helpful in my thinking with this have written two contrasting pieces. Haberman talked about what he calls a pedagogy of poverty. And he says, you know, there are classrooms in many schools these days where almost everything is about teachers telling information, asking right answer questions, giving directions, practicing low-level tasks, monitoring seat work, reviewing, giving tests, going over tests, assigning homework, going over homework, settling disputes, punishing kids, grading papers, and giving grades. Now, all those things all of us do sometimes, but he's talking about classrooms where this is pretty much the wallpaper. And he says, I can tell you two sad things about kids who experience a pedagogy of poverty. One is most of those kids are poor. In other words, these kinds of classes tend to be overpopulated with students of color and low-income students. And he says the second thing is when kids get a steady diet of this, you've just guaranteed them poverty forever because there's no way for them to break loose really in the world. By contrast, Helene Hodges says, there are classes in almost every school where kids are doing authentic tasks and they have meaning-rich curriculum, literacy-rich environment, very interesting resources, connections between home and culture and community, problem-focused learning, kids being aware of their own thinking, lots of collaboration, bunches of different kinds of grouping, continual dialogue to figure things out, and making meaning. And paralleling Haberman, Hodges said, I can tell you two things about these classes. Most of them right now are made up of more privileged kids, in other words, kids who have plenty. And the kids who have a steady diet of these classes have a recipe, a doorway open for plenty in their futures. What would happen if we taught a pedagogy of plenty in every classroom and differentiated it by scaffolding up so more kids had a crack at that? What if we reversed the trend that's the case across the country, certainly not every classroom in every school by any means, but that kids of color and low-income kids are likely to have weaker teachers and kids of plenty are likely to have stronger teachers? What if we taught all of our teachers to try to think more like teachers of high-end kids and work with their students in that way? Would we change any of our decisions? Lorna Earle, who's a Canadian educator, has this comment in a book that she wrote, and it's a little prickly, and I think she's probably right. She says it's the teacher's overriding moral purpose to meet the needs of students, even when it conflicts with personal preferences. How would we teach if we were determined to do the most ethically robust thing that we could do? Just really interesting to think about. I'll tell you a real quick story with that, which I think is one reason this stays on my mind so much. I was teaching a class of pre-service teachers several years ago, and there was a young woman in there who was the kind of student that you just are so excited to have in a class. She loved what she was learning. She was immersed in it. She asked terrific questions. She was doing additional work on the outside, not for brownie points, but because she just loved it. I guess we were 5 or 6 weeks into class, and I gave the students an index card, and I said, I want you to tell me on the index card one thing that has changed in your thinking in the last 6 weeks in this class. It can be something you didn't know before and now you know it. It can be something a belief that you've changed. It can be something that you feel more strongly about. It can be something that you're arguing with. I don't have anything in mind. I just want to know what's changed in your thinking in the last 6 weeks. And this really stellar young woman who was at this point about 8 weeks from graduating and becoming a teacher said, this is the first time in my education preparation that I have understood that teaching is an ethically based profession. And I thought, holy cow, how'd that happen? The student who is as well prepared and as excited as anybody I've ever seen, and somehow we miss the notion that ethics is central in what we do. So I think it's a great question to ask ourselves, from what ethical basis do we operate? So we're going to give you a chance to reflect on that just a little bit, and we'll let Elizabeth set up this thought question for you.
Carol, I think we're going to have to skip this question because I do want to make sure we get to everything, and we have still another question at the end for folks to weigh in on. But in lieu of this question, I do want to just call attention to 2 questions over in the parking lot. Kate is asking about your thoughts on how universal design for learning, UDL, aligns with differentiated instruction and the notions you've been talking about. That might be a little bigger than we want to bite off right now, but if you could give us a quick response to that.
Sure, I can give you a quick one. I think the two models are going in exactly the same direction. I've worked with the UDL folks before. Some of them have come to our institutes on differentiation here at UVA. I don't see anything in those conversations or in our reading that has any different intent at all. The version of differentiation that I use casts a slightly bigger tent. UDL had its roots in working with kids who have learning problems, tends to be a little more focused on the lower grades than on high school, although it's applicable everywhere, has tended to focus a little more on math and literacy rather than all subjects, although it belongs in all subjects and works in all of them, has tended to have a very strong connection with uses of technology, which are becoming much more pervasive, of course, than when UDL started. So it's a little bit more specific, but there isn't a single thing that UDL is recommending that I find any problems with, and I believe the same would be true the other way around. I think it's just different, slightly different versions of the same end goals.
Wonderful, wonderful. I know others were interested in a similar question, how to attend to the needs of students with disabilities. So that touches on it in some way. The other question that Cindy is asking, that several folks had asked us in advance of today's webinar, was related to dealing with advanced learners. So students who might be gifted and talented, students who are above grade level. How are we making sure that differentiation meets their needs? And maybe you can speak quickly on that.
Sure. To me, it's all of the same fabric. My job is to understand the trajectory of learning. In general, how do kids in science progress through this content that we're working with? In general, how do kids progress in this math trajectory that goes from grade 1 to grade 6 or grade 3 to grade 5 or whatever piece you want to pick up? I need to understand that trajectory, and then I need to try to figure out, as Hattie says, where my kids are in that trajectory and move them on. And so for a high-end kid, one of the hard things as a teacher is to say, you know what, I see evidence here that the kid knows this, and I'd really like to believe that he can't truly know it until he's heard it from me, but that's probably not the case. If I've got evidence that he knows it, I need to move him on. And unfortunately, that's one of a number of places where we tend to fall a little short with differentiation. We worry about the strugglers, and we're trying really hard to help them propel themselves down the road. And then we just feel so grateful that these other kids got it, that we sometimes don't put the energy there. It's exactly the same thing. What do I do to help this kid work in greater depth, with greater complexity, with more variables, with more abstraction? There are lots of language, lots of approaches that we know to use with high-end kids to help them move forward. And we need to be doing that for them exactly as we would for any other kid in the class. Every kid ought to be able to come to school every day with the sense that that teacher is going to push them.
Absolutely. Let's move us into the next section, talking about how we can do this in practice. And I think that's a good question lots of folks have had, is how do I do this?
Okay, so this is the part that I'm suspecting that many of you are particularly interested in, so I'm pretty invested in trying to make sure that we get this done. Elizabeth, you'll have to help me because we've got some other buckets after this, so you're going to have to decide how to prioritize, but I do want us to have some real time to spend here because these are the images we need in our heads to work. I want to show you some examples of teachers differentiating based on student readiness, based on student interest, and based on student learning profile. Readiness to support growth, interest to support motivation, learning profile to support efficiency. And I'm going to begin with an example of teaching up. But I want to say to you, I've chosen some reasonably robust examples here. In other words, I didn't pick necessarily step one. And I want to be sure to say to you, hope all of you will hear this, that what I'm going to show you may well be more advanced than where you feel like you are. You may be more advanced than this. I have no way of knowing that right now. But there are 1,000 little things we can do in a classroom to differentiate that don't look nearly as complicated as this. If I can learn just to meet with small groups, if I can learn how to have my class working productively so I can work with this group of 6 and then this group of 7 and then this group of 4 over a class period or over 2 days, that's a huge benefit to students. If I can do little mini classes, mini lectures where I say to kids, I'm noticing as I walk around that a good many of you are struggling with this point in the math problem. If you're having any difficulty with this, come sit over here on the floor with me for just a minute and let's go back through this together again. Just do a little mini class like that, and students who need the help can come sit with you and send them back when you're finished. It's possible to create 2 different homework assignments tonight, one for kids who really don't need this work with computation or the drill on the vocabulary and language, and who could work with something meatier, and other kids who may need the task that you had in mind. If we just use our imagination and understand what I'm trying to do is know where we're going, who's where, and move them ahead, and trust yourself, you'll invent lots of ways to differentiate. It doesn't have to look like what I'm going to show you at all. Give yourself permission to start small and keep growing. Just don't give yourself permission to stand still. You don't need to push yourself off the cliff, but standing still is not going to ever get us anywhere either. So that sermon ended. Let's take a look here for a minute at some examples. Again, I'm going to show you a readiness example with upper elementary social studies, which I think exhibits teaching up very well, a readiness example in primary math, an example in middle school English where a teacher's differentiating on interest, and an example in high school world history where the teacher is differentiating based on learning profile. The first example is particularly rich with the idea of teaching up, but look for teaching up in all the examples. What does teaching up mean? As I noted to you before, it means planning first for advanced kids and then differentiating by scaffolding up. It means that you're trying to give access to as many kids as you possibly can to the richest, best, most compelling stuff that you know to teach. And it's a key premise of differentiation. So a part of good differentiation and good teaching is clarity about goals. And I ask my students to tell me before they share a unit with me or a lesson what kids should know, what they should understand, and what they should be able to do as a result of that unit, that lesson, that week, that year. If any of you've worked with understanding by design, this is exactly what Wiggins and McTighe are talking about. Knows are essential knowledge, understands are essential understandings, do's are essential skills. So this is a lesson about New World explorers, in other words, the people who set off with not too much certainty about what was going to happen from Europe and ended up someplace in our neck of the woods and discovered land that was new to them, opportunities that were new to them, certainly not to the people who already lived here, but new to them. So in this upper elementary unit, and I think it was a 5th grade class, the kids had been doing a really lot of interesting work. The teacher had helped them understand the status of science at that point in history, and therefore what people did and didn't know about how the universe was shaped. They talked about how we might get that distance now and how different that would have been than the transportation people would have had. Whether these guys on boats had enough money to finance themselves and where the money might have come from and what the motivations might have been to finance the trips and those kinds of things, had been doing some really good background. I'm guessing maybe a couple of weeks before this particular lesson that I'm going to show you. So this is not the first lesson in the unit. On this particular day, the teacher said to the kids, guys, we've talked a lot about the circumstances of the explorations, but you really haven't had a chance too much yet to get to know any of the explorers really deeply. We'll keep working on that over time, but today what I want you to do is this. I want you to choose 2 New World explorers from this list that I'm going to present to you that we've discussed in class. If there's some other people you've read about that you want to add to the list, just come tell me. And I want you to pick 2 of those people that seem kind of interesting to you. And your job is to learn basic information about those 2 New World explorers, and then I'm going to give you some work to do with that. What she wants the kids to know is what is basic data about the two explorers and why do we still know them? What were their contributions? Why do we consider them important enough to talk about them this many years later? What she wants them to understand is that exploration, wherever it happens, involves risk, involves cost, involves benefits, and success and failure. So you see exploration, it's risky. It's going to have both upsides and downsides. You're going to see people succeeding and failing in process. And she wants them to do a good old Common Core thing, use resource materials to illustrate and support your ideas. Now at this point, these goals are not up on a wall in front of kids. They're in her mind when she's planning the unit. And so she creates a lesson, and this is what it says. And her directions were longer and easier to read than mine. I've chunked them for you. I've sort of synthesized them or distilled them. Okay, guys, I'm going to give you a list of resources, books, websites, pamphlets, charts, and I'm going to give you some choices of products, how you show what you figure out. Your job is to show how your two key explorers took chances, how they experienced success and failure, and how they brought about both positive and negative change. You should provide proof or evidence from the resources that you select to use to tell whether those things are true. Did your explorer take chances? Did he experience success and failure? Did he bring about both positive and negative change? And those product options you have, well, you can do one of three things. You can do a first-person monologue from the captain's viewpoint, and we'll tape that and people can look at it. You can do a series of storyboards that maps out the sequence of events and how those events answer this question, or you can do a chart that shows that. If you have a fourth way you'd like to show what you know instead, just come tell me and we'll work on that. So if we were in a room together and I could see your eyeballs, I'd ask you to think about this for a minute and tell me whether you think this is a reasonably robust task for a fifth grade kid. And I think most of us would say that if we had kids in classrooms where they were doing this kind of work, we'd think it was, pretty complimentary of the kid, pretty big deal. She also has a second version of the task, and this is the second version. Using reliable and defensible research, and by the way, I'm not going to give you a list of resources, you figure out a way to show how these New World explorers that you choose are paradoxes. Include and go beyond the unit's principles. So in other words, you're going to have to figure out whether they did take risks, have success and failure, create both costs and benefits. Those are kind of paradoxical that they could happen at the same time, but you're going to have to find some more ways these guys were paradoxical. If you thought version 1 was fairly robust, of course version 2 is going to blow version 1 out of the water. This to me is a good example of teaching up. This teacher created version 2 first. This would be very challenging to most kids that I taught for 20 years at that age. Even the very most advanced kids would have to do a fair amount of chewing. I think this would certainly be challenging for them. Hopefully not so far in front of them they can't do anything, but challenging. Am I going to only give this second task to kids identified as gifted? Absolutely not. I've got some kids identified as gifted who are going to do much better on version 1. And I might have some kids that have learning disabilities who have a devil of a time reading and writing who would really benefit from the stretch in version 2, so then I can just modify the way that kid uses the material. So I'm not talking about gifted and not gifted, but I'm talking about who can really fly off the coop and who needs to do some work that's going to really cause them to struggle and stretch and accomplish pretty nearly the same thing, just not quite as complex as the other one. So in other words, she created version 2 first, and then she scaffolded it so more kids could accomplish it. How did she do that? Instead of just saying, find some defensible and reliable research, she gave them a list of resources to use. Instead of just saying to them, figure out how you're going to show what you know, she gave them directions for 3 separate product options and let them propose another one. She delineated the goals for version 1, And the second group of kids are going to have to refer to something else to get them. And she's talking in version 2 in much more advanced language in terms of paradoxes in human behavior. So she scaffolded version 1, but the kids who are going to do that are going to still end up in pretty much the same place as version 2. So what if you have some kids in your class for whom version 1 is going to be way out of their zone of proximal development? Then what? Well, there are tons of things you can do to further scaffold it. For example, instead of saying here's a list of resources, I can have a couple of tables where I put boxes with resources in them that I know are readable and usable for those kids, including some audio ones or some internet ones. I can have kids meet in startup groups with me to work on their plan for how they're going to go and lay it out step by step and go from there. I can let some kids do both reading and writing in their first language as they get the stuff under their belt before I ask them then to put it into English for me. I can use brainstorming groups or think tank groups so that kids can work collegially on things. I can provide graphic organizers that guide them step by step through the process. I could give some kids the directions one step at a time, and they do much better. I can have some kids check in with me after every step to make sure that they're okay. I could have kids do a timeline checklist. I could write the directions with more basic vocabulary or give them annotated vocabulary. I could write the directions in more bulleted form with more white space. I could provide a model that's spare and not particularly glitzy, but accurate at a fairly foundational level so kids could see what the thing might look like. I could provide a summary of ideas in the kids' first language to support their comprehension. I could provide a list of key vocabulary with clear explanations. I could use experts of the day to answer their questions. My point is that if you can create a task that really is robust enough for advanced learners, there are lots of ways to open that up to access for other kids. And to me, that notion of teaching up, starting with something really robust and enabling other kids to make the climb, is going to get us much, much further than creating in the middle and trying to pump it up and pump it down, which is often the case. And we have some very strong examples of schools where teachers have learned to teach up and have differentiated in that way. And the achievement gains are exactly what your common sense would tell you they should be and what we would hope that they would be. So that's my first example, differentiation by readiness. Group 1 is at a different starting point than Group 2. And the teacher, instead of saying, well, let me give Group 1 words to practice or just get them to do information about the explorers, has insisted that they also think about this on a more abstract level, but with more support and more scaffolding. So I want to show you now a kindergarten lesson that a teacher did based on student readiness, and it's an early in the year, about this time of year actually, lesson on classification and patterns. And as is the case in kindergarten, they're going to work with classifications and patterns all year long. But this one little example, again, shows a teacher who in a very quick lesson has made some differences in the task for kids' readiness levels in a way that supports their success. Again, what she wants the kids to know is the names of basic shapes, sizes, bigger than, less than, colors, what it means to have a pattern, what kind of patterns are, how to classify, and what classify means and what a category means. The understandings are written at a young level. We can classify things by their shapes, sizes, and colors. Things can be made smaller or bigger than other things. Patterns can help us classify things, and I can explain why I classify things in a certain way. And what she wants them to be able to do is identify basic shapes, basic colors, identify larger than and smaller than, classify according to size, color, shape, identify and explain patterns, and explain reasons for classification. This is not all new in this lesson. This is stuff they've been working on for the last month and stuff they're going to continue to work on for quite some time during the year. But this lesson falls within this set of what we call KU D's, what kids should know, understand, and be able to do. So here's what she did. One afternoon, not too long before the kids were going home, she had them go out to do a nature's walk. And they had been talking about fall, about autumn, and she asked the kids to gather data on what they were seeing that seemed to them like evidence that fall was there. And so she gave them little carpenter's aprons that had 3 pockets in them, and every kid put on their carpenter's apron. And when they went on the walk, they gathered data that they saw, acorns falling down, leaves that were down, dead flowers, sticks, whatever, and they put them in their little apron pockets. And then they went back in the room, and she had them analyze their data. And so just as a whole class, she would say, well, Elizabeth has a rock here. Anybody have anything that's kind of like Elizabeth's rock? And some kids might bring rocks over. She'd say, does anybody else have anything that's kind of like Elizabeth's rock, even though it's not a rock? And so somebody might say, I have something round and her rock is round. She's just working with them in a very general way to talk to them about thinking about what they have. When they went home, she gathered the data herself from the tabletops and was pulling from that just leaves. And so she had a task for them to do early the next day, and at every desk there were some leaves. And there were 3 different things that kids could do with those leaves, depending on their readiness levels again. Some of the kids she asked to classify leaves by their size and by their color. So big leaves, little leaves, red leaves, green leaves. And she gave them a grid that had categories on it where they could put their leaves to show that this is a big leaf, this is a red leaf, and so forth. Some kids were asked to classify leaves by shape and to create a category. And she gave them a sample grid, which they could use if they wanted to, but they could also find a different way to show the patterns that they were coming up with if they wanted to. And some kids were asked to find 3 ways to classify every leaf other than color. And their job was to find a way to show what configurations, what classifications they came up with. Every kid was working with the leaves. Every kid's working with their idea that scientists classify by patterns. Every student is going to be working with the K's and the U's and the D's. She moved among the students to talk with them about how they were classifying things and how they could explain their thinking, to make notes if she saw students that were having misunderstandings about what was going on and so forth. But what you really have here is 3 classification tasks. Classifying by size and by color is obviously more familiar to many kids than trying to classify a leaf by a shape and by then coming up with a category. And when you eliminate color as a category and then ask kids to find 3 ways to classify a leaf, they're clearly having to push the boundaries a little bit more. But in each case, she's asking the kids to make classifications, to show the patterns that they're finding, and to be able to explain what they're doing. So again, an example of differentiation by readiness, rather than having everybody do task 1, when you've got lots of kids who will be really challenged by task 3, and whose time would be totally wasted if they were doing task number 1. Not terribly difficult to pull off, pretty useful. So this next one is an example of an interest-based differentiation, not so much readiness, but what's your preference here in terms of things to learn about, how to approach things. So the lesson is focused on some Common Core standards that deal with development of theme, understanding text, and using text evidence to support a position. And she asked the students to choose a person of interest from a sphere of interest to do an inquiry on. So if you love sports, you can choose a person from sports. If you're a great science fiction reader, you can choose a science fiction author. If you really love stock car racing, you can choose somebody who's a dynamite stock car racer, a person of interest from a sphere of interest. And then all of the kids have to use fiction, nonfiction, print, video, music, art, not all of those things, but they have to use multiple sources in their inquiry. So they could use newscasts, they could use blogs, they could use photographs. And their goal, because this is focused on the notion of theme in literature, is to propose themes that represent the life and work of the person that they chose in a way that represents what's important in that discipline. So you wouldn't end up saying for a famous athlete, for example, you know, he has a collection of bicycles, end of story. You're going to have to tell us what it is in his life that propels him to be a greater athlete. What is it that matters in athletics that he really represents? So what theme do you see in this person that's representative of something important in the discipline where that person is? They had to do a theme-based interview as though they were interviewing the person, but finding data, you know, from different sources to comprise what the answers would be. She showed them the website People of New York and helped them understand how the captions in the People of New York website sort of distill a human message. And so they had to do an image of their person in a People of New York type way that, again, gives sort of a theme statement for that person. They had to find a theme-based quote, which could either be a quote from that person that represents their theme, or a quote from some other famous person that represents the life of this person. So, for example, you might have Joe DiMaggio, and a quote that you found might be one from Robert Frost to explain something that was important about Joe DiMaggio, although he wasn't talking about Joe DiMaggio, of course. And then they had to do a product or an idea for a product that their person might have used based on the discipline in which that person worked. So what would be a terrific art pencil that this person would have benefited from using in some way if somebody created a pencil that would have really pushed forward this person's work in art. One of the most important things that they did was to keep a process log that recorded their work, preliminary themes that they came up and what evidence was leading them to those, final themes that they developed for their person with supporting evidence for why they now think those are the best themes or that's the best theme they could come up with, and their rationale for distilling it to that point, and an annotation of the final product, which was the performance assessment, and how they feel like they did on that. This is a long-term piece of work that students did throughout a considerable period of a year, and the kids kept going back to it. The teacher kept going back to it as they would look at different Common Core standards. So this is a hefty one. This is a long-term piece of work. Here, she can vary resources based on readability. The kids can certainly make choices about product format that are learning profile based. She can do scaffolding like providing graphic organizers or resources for kids who need some help with that. So there are ways to deal with it in terms of readiness, but what she really has done here is create an interest-based task. And it's kind of interesting when you see that, because the kids really were very devoted to these people that they chose. They frequently did work that was pretty surprising. They were willing to keep at it and go at it because they wanted to know more about this musician and so forth. So an example of a middle school interest-based task. And again, I want to remind you there are 1,000 things you can do that are much less sophisticated than these examples I'm showing you that really benefit kids. I just want to show you some reasonably robust examples of what this might look like after teachers have worked with it for a while. So this last one I want to share with you is kind of an interesting one. This is learning profile again, and this means how you take in and process information. And the work of Howard Gardner, I think, has been instructive for lots of folks in helping us understand, or at least be more aware of the fact that many people bring a whole range of talents to a process with them, and that if we look only narrowly at what we think counts, a lot of the world is left out. And so we've often seen Gardner's multiple intelligences translated into a class. What's a kinesthetic approach to this particular task? What's a verbal linguistic approach, and so forth. This particular high school class is working with another piece of Gardner's work that he calls entry points. It's related to his work on multiple intelligences, but slightly different. And he says that if we can enter a study, whether it's at the beginning or enter it in greater depth later in the study, through a pathway that feels natural and exciting to us, that once again we're much more likely to dig deeper. And so he proposes that there are always at least 5 entry points that a teacher could use, or that a person himself could use in developing an inquiry. We could approach something through a narrational entry point, stories and words, or through a logical quantitative one. How would we study this subject through numbers and with measurement? Or we can look at it foundationally. What's the philosophy, the background, the rationale, the root system, the history of this particular thing? Or we can look at it aesthetically. How would we translate this thing into music, into smell, into sound, into movement? Or we can study it experientially. How has this happened in my life? How has it happened in the life of other people? And so the teacher that I'm going to show you in this high school class chose to have his students study this particular topic in, or to introduce this particular topic in history through multiple entry points avenue. So the kids are getting ready to study the Middle Ages in high school world history. Even the 1920s seems like a long time ago to high school kids, of course, and the Middle Ages is awfully hard to really wrap around. You know, what is it that's actually going on there? Why is life as it is there? And in his head, if the kids could really understand a cathedral, what it was like to build a cathedral back then, why people would have built it, the kind of technology that might have been there, the place that played in their lives, the symbolism in the cathedral and why that spoke to the times, they would not only understand and appreciate a cathedral better, but the cathedral becomes a symbol for this time in history. And so some kids chose to study cathedrals through novels and stories built around cathedrals. A lot of Madeleine L'Engle's work is built there. The Hunchback of Notre Dame, there are any number of actual novels and stories, whether for young people or adults, that are built around cathedrals. What can you learn through stories about how a cathedral is? If you're more interested in the logical, quantitative stuff, how did cathedral get built? What kind of engineering did they use? What sorts of tools do we have now that they didn't use? How long did it take to build these? How can somebody build these things without the kind of tools we're used to having? What does it mean to engineer a cathedral? Some other kids looked at symbolisms in cathedrals. Why are they built in the shape that they're built in? What does a rose window in a cathedral mean? Why do people sit in different places in a cathedral? What's the architecture of the front of the cathedral, and why is it built like it is? And some other kids chose to do work on what he called your cathedral. And that's the place that centers you, the place that helps you understand yourself best, the place that gives you energy to go forward in the world. Could be the treehouse in your backyard. It could be cooking with your granddad when he's outside cooking fish, whatever. What's your cathedral? What's the place for you that's going to play the role in your life that the cathedral might have played in the Middle Ages? Once again, these are choices based on what Gardner would call intelligence preferences. And look at a class like this. The kids had the assignment for a while, worked on it while some other stuff was going on in class that helped them get some background. But amazing how many contributions the kids made to class, how many good questions they were asking, what a great way it was for him to get them to engage in discussion and trust one another as a community and share materials and that kind of thing. So this is an example of an introductory task, which again started fairly near the beginning of a unit on the Middle Ages in world history and kept on for a while with kids working on it largely out of class and when they had some spare time in class, but feeding a great deal of what went on. Not so much based on their readiness, not so much necessarily based on an interest they have, but really a mode of exploration, a mode of taking in and processing information, a how you learn kind of thing. So those
Carol,
are, yeah.
we're dangerously close to our
Yes,
ending
we are.
time. Did not get through several slides, and I want to make sure that I think that time was well spent, and I'm hoping that folks really appreciated those examples. I know I did like hearing those and hearing the realm of examples and ways that you have seen this work in classrooms. So I think that those who are in the classroom and those who are working with teachers can really take that back and look at how they can apply those lessons. What I do want to spend just a minute or two on is having you give us the highlights of leadership and how influential leadership can be on this topic of differentiation and making it real in schools for us.
Okay. So I think if it's okay, Elizabeth, I'll do that just not so much with trying to go through slides, but just sort of summarizing what a number of them would say and then, you know, referring folks to them as a resource that's here.
Absolutely. Folks should know that there's a lot of information on the slides. That's what I was going to say, is that you have access to all of this. So I think just the high level now, and then our audience can go in and look at the details on the slides.
Leaders who help teachers be more responsive in their teaching really see differentiation not as a frill, but as central to effective teaching. I think it's important for a leader not necessarily to run in and create a differentiated lesson plan on the spot in some teacher's room and model it tomorrow, but to understand those 5 elements that Adam was talking about and that we looked at a couple of times early in the session, and to understand the fundamental nature of those in classrooms, and to be ready to work with teachers on creating environments and what quality curriculum looks like and what some things are we can do to formatively assess students and respond to the data that we get. It's critically important for leaders to help teachers understand that improving our responsiveness to students is not something that we do in an afternoon staff development. It's something that is an ongoing process in which teachers ought to have voice. I think this is my next step. This is something I'm really invested in doing. In the slides that we're not going to look at now, for those of you who are leaders, there are some lists of at least a good starting point of what teachers need to know, what they need to understand, and what they need to be able to do in order to grow effectively and systematically in differentiation. In other words, I'm going to suggest that leaders need to know the KUDs of differentiation, just like good teachers need to know the KUDs of this math unit. I think a good leader helps teachers understand a rationale for doing something when it's going to be complex and demanding. And so having a vision for differentiation, why would we do this, is sort of the equivalent of a teacher having a vision for a classroom in which people collaborate to benefit the growth of all of them. If you just say to kids, okay, we're going to do this now, go move the material here, do this, the kids are confused and can't figure it out and it doesn't make sense. But in the context of a vision for every student's growth, kids can get pretty excited no matter their age about being a part of making that work. So a great leader provides a vision. I think there is then a sense of being able to say what a teacher would say. I have a year, or I have 2 years, or 3 years, 5 years, that we're going to grow with this. And so I'm going to come up with a systematic plan, a big picture of where we'd like to be in a year, 2 years, 3 years with this. And then a subset of plans. What are we going to work on first? What are we going to work on second? What are we going to work on third? The principals that I see who make a big difference in differentiation are in teachers' classes a lot, not to judge them and not to evaluate them, but to engage in conversations which help both of them grow and help the understanding develop while the idea stays in the foreground. One of the most important things that I would commend to a leader in a school is that this is the perfect opportunity to model for your teachers what you want them to do in a classroom. If you go back to the 5 principles Adam had, what kind of learning environment will encourage your teachers to come every day and continue to grow? What are the KUDs that you have for the curriculum for your teachers, and what will you do to make it engaging and to promote understanding with it? How will you formatively assess teachers, not to give them a grade or to judge them, but to help everybody talk about what the next steps are? What kinds of assessment of teacher growth will you use, and how will you give feedback? When you see teachers struggling with different things, how might you be able to arrange them in subgroups to work together or to do independent work so that they're moving on from their own entry points rather than assuming that it all has to be whole faculty staff development? And what will you do to help the teachers want to work with you on that and to develop routines of flexibility that still bring people to the same place? The teachers that I hear who have made the most progress talk very clearly about the fact that their leaders' behavior actually helped them understand the benefit of differentiation, because as they could see the leaders work with them in ways that were useful, they began to understand that doing that for their students would make a difference as well. So in the materials that are here, you'll see, if you're a leader, a number of documents that are here, not because I ever intended to talk through all of them, but to say these are resources to inform your thinking some. And as the folks on Car Talk would say, this next thing I'm going to show you is from the shameless commerce division here. But if any of you have an interest in reading something about leading for differentiation, my friend Mike Murphy, who is an expert on change in schools, and I have just, will in about a week see a book come off the press at ASCD. It's called Leading for Differentiation, comes out on September 25th. And what it really talks about is how we apply what we know about leaders who encourage change in school to change for differentiation. So if you have an interest there, that also might be a good resource for you to look at. I think my final point, I might just as well go back here to do. Differentiation is just an approach to teaching that says we really kind of have to try to do what works for kids, not just what works for us. It isn't an extra thing, it's high quality teaching. If you look, for example, at Charlotte Danielson's framework for teaching, her expert teaching column is full of the language of differentiation. There's plenty of support for differentiation in terms of research, demographics, and ethics. If we're going to learn to differentiate, we have to have some intent to do it. We need intelligent support. We need actionable feedback. And we need time. And that does not happen on a broad scale. There will always be some teachers who figure out something and go forward on their own. But we don't find broad scale change in any meaningful thing in schools without informed principal leadership. Principal leadership is massively important. So thank you for sticking with us today. That's maybe more about toad frogs than you had in mind for one afternoon. It's a complicated topic. And if you picked up one or two ideas, even from your very first parking lot entries, to go back and think a little bit about more, that'll push you further forward. So,
Carol, I know we could spend another 2 hours with you. Of course, we didn't get through everything, but I think we got through a lot of the important points. And I know that if folks want to reach out to you, I'm going to put up your contact information. You would be glad to probably respond to their questions. Let me see if I can get to that. There it is. If folks have general questions about the REL webinar series, please reach out to me. I would be happy to answer. We'll put up the materials, like I said earlier. You'll get an email with that, and we'll ask you to send it to others who you think might be benefit from that information, if they want to see the webinar, if you want to take a look at the FAQ document with the answers to your questions, all of the resources that are included today will be listed there. So we're past time, and thank you all for staying with us. We're going to do two last-minute things for those who have a few extra minutes to spend. We will put up this last poll because we'd like to hear from you about your key takeaways and some of the action steps that you might want to take as you go back to your context, your schools, your districts, and the work that you do. And we will also encourage you to come to our next webinar, which will be in 2 weeks from today, on the topic of mathematics in the Common Core, what effective teaching looks like in math in this Common Core era. So at this time, as you continue to type, I would like to just do a virtual round of applause for Carol and the time she spent with us really diving into this topic. I know I appreciate it, and I hope that all of you do too. So thank you so much, Carol.
My pleasure.
And if you do have additional questions, please just post them in the parking lot. We'll be here for a few minutes, and we'll make sure that Carol won't respond to them now, but we'll make sure that we get those and do our best to put those in our FAQ document for you to check in with later. We also encourage you to take the evaluation so you can help us improve the series, make sure that we're meeting your needs. It's always helpful for us to know what topics you're interested in hearing about that we haven't addressed yet. And as we plan for our future webinars, we like to take that information into consideration. All right, we'll leave the room open for just a little bit longer, but we thank you all for attending. We hope you have a great afternoon and evening, and we hope to see you back for our next webinar.